Rupert, welcome as ever to the programme. Can I get your reflections on the continuing missile and drone attacks being carried out by Russia across Ukraine? What use are they, quite simply, Rupert? I mean, it's a hideous experience for those at the end of those attacks, but the evidence seems to be that they're strengthening the resolves of Ukrainians across the country and using up munitions which Russia can't spare.
Yeah, there's a kind of contradiction in this, isn't there? Because, of course, they bring great suffering, great misery, horror to the people of Ukraine, aside from the damage it's doing to their infrastructure. And yet, history tells us that these sort of bombing campaigns have the opposite effect of what they're intended. They're intended to crush the will of people, but robust populations such as the Ukrainians tend not to bow to such terror. It's been tried and tested as a method of war for as long as we've had these sort of munitions, and it tends not to work against people like the Ukrainians. So it's kind of there's a rather unpleasant contradiction to it.
Well, you'd imagine, Rupert, the Russian commanders can see what we can see, which is strengthening Ukrainian resolve, not the opposite. And what about the effects on Russian opinion, insofar as Russian leaders care about that? They have to care to some extent. I mean, clearly their country, they've been told, is fighting a just war, and they're causing a level of civilian innocent suffering which can't be disguised.
Yeah, but I think there's two elements to that, isn't there? So one of the reasons why, of course, they are using these sort of methods is that the Ukrainians continue to humiliate the Russians, both at a strategic level, with the bombing of the Kerch Bridge, for example, but on the battlefield, day in, day out, we see it. The Ukrainians have the momentum. And the Russian military, and indeed Moscow, haven't been able to come up with really credible ways to retake the momentum in the way that they'd wish. And so this sort of attack at least allows them to claim, at least to Putin in the first instance, that they are doing something. The fact that most strategists would say it's a failed strategy is kind of moot, if you like, from their perspective. But
Yes.
but you highlight a really important point, John, that the public in Russia, many of them can see that this is a failed strategy, and there's a great deal of chat online about that. But equally, there are plenty in Moscow who will believe the version of events that Putin and state media put out.
We are hearing, haven't we? President Zelensky himself has said that Ukraine's energy infrastructure has been significantly damaged. I think he said a third of the network has been damaged. So from that point of view, Russia is achieving what it wants to achieve with winter coming.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. They can point to achieving some effect, as you say, 30% President Zelensky says has been damaged in the last 8 days or so. I think we need to be realistic. Our friends, the Ukrainians, they were in for a hard winter no matter what. War in winter is tough, and it's going to be doubly so. And I'm sure President Zelensky and indeed all of his team will now be preparing for what lies ahead. There's already talk about trying to encourage people to limit their use of electricity and the like. I think that is very sensible.
Yes.
They're in for a tough winter.
And we are meanwhile seeing all over social media, aren't we, images, pictures of Russians being literally snatched off the streets. I saw a report about an airline pilot, being grabbed out of his airline cockpit before takeoff by Russian police and hauled off for conscription. I mean, Russians can see these, you'd imagine. Maybe they don't have quite the same access that we do, but they can see what's going on, and it must have a debilitating effect on morale in that country.
I think that's right. President Putin's announcement last month of this partial mobilization has been fraught with difficulties, and no evidence that it's led to any additional capability on the battlefield. And indeed, it'll be months before it would have any effect on the battlefield. But boy, oh boy, it's having a negative impact back at home at all sorts of levels. I wonder whether he's slightly ruining that decision.
Yeah, and maybe even you can't answer this question, but the talk of Russians massing forces on the Belarusian border, the Belarusian leader who pretty much generally does what he's told, is going along with what's happening there, talking about Belarus, of course, supporting the Russian war, but Russian troops there. Is this a feint? Do you think, Rupert, or is it a new offensive in the making?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to tell, isn't it? As you say, Lukashenko tends to do what Putin says. There's talk of Russian troops massing on the border from where they can potentially strike towards Kyiv. So, it certainly will get my eyes and minds looking in that direction. There's then talk of some kind of joint border force, because allegedly, according to Lukashenko, NATO pose a threat to his borders. So no matter what, the mere fact that we're talking about it, they'll be talking about it in Kyiv, so they have to take it seriously. They'll be committing intelligence resources to look at it, to see just how serious it is. Of course, Kyiv is well protected no matter what. But what Russia will be seeking to do is to draw forces away from the other fronts, whether or not Putin intends to attack from that direction.
Okay.